All right, let's dive right in. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the absolute most shocking, dramatic, and honestly consequential moments leading straight up to World War II. We're talking about the 1938 Anschluss. Today, we're going to look closely at exactly how the map of Europe was entirely rewritten without a single shot being fired. And what you should really take away from this is how the complete failure of international diplomacy set the stage for a global catastrophe. Let's get to it. So picture this. It's March 12th, 1938. German troops are crossing the border into Austria. But here's the crazy part. There is absolutely no declaration of war, there's no resistance. In fact, there's no battle at all. Instead, the advancing soldiers are met with roads lined by cheering crowds. People are literally throwing flowers, women are weeping with joy, and men are raising their arms in Nazi salutes. In a single, unbelievable day, Austria, a sovereign nation of 7 million people, simply ceases to exist. And the rest of the world? They did absolutely nothing. It's this terrifyingly festive atmosphere masking a massive geopolitical takeover. To understand why this matters so much, you have to realize that the Anschluss wasn't just about what Hitler took. It was about what he learned. He learned he could basically take whatever he wanted. Section 1. A head without a body. Understanding post-World War I Austria. Okay, to make sense of this, we have to look back. Before 1918, Austria was the beating heart of the mighty Habsburg Empire. We're talking about a massive global power ruling over 50 million people across this huge patchwork of nationalities. But after the First World War and the total collapse of that empire, look at what was left: a small, landlocked, economically struggling country of just 7 million people. And at the center of it was Vienna, this magnificent, sprawling capital city built to manage an empire of 50 million, now ruling over a tiny fraction of that. It was, as the phrase goes, a head without a body. In fact, many Austrian citizens didn't even believe their brand new country was viable. Back in 1918 and 1919, the Austrian parliament actually voted to unite with Germany. But the victorious Allied powers explicitly forbade it in the peace treaties. They definitely weren't about to let Germany emerge from a massive defeat somehow larger than when it entered the war. But that desire for union, or Anschluss, it simmered quietly for decades. To see how that desire for union eventually boiled over, let's trace the timeline. In the 1930s, Austria was in deep, deep economic and political trouble. They're dealing with the Great Depression and some really intense political violence. In 1934, Austrian Nazis, backed directly by Hitler, attempted a coup. They actually assassinated the Austrian chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, literally leaving him to bleed to death on a sofa. But the coup failed. Why? Well, the Austrian army stayed loyal. And crucially, Italy's Mussolini sent troops to the border, basically signaling Hitler to back off. And Hitler actually did. But watch what happens next. By 1936, the strategic map completely shifts. The Rome-Berlin axis is formalized. Mussolini gets drawn closer to Germany through the Spanish Civil War and becomes totally dependent on Hitler's support. Almost overnight, Italy goes from being Austria's protector to Germany's ally. The geopolitical momentum has completely shifted in Hitler's favor, setting the absolute perfect stage for February 1938. Section 2. Intimidating Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, the diplomatic pressure cooker. Fast forward to 1938. The new Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg is in an impossible position. His country is economically weak, politically divided, and now completely diplomatically isolated without Italy there to protect them. In February, Hitler summons Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. But let's be clear, this is not a diplomatic meeting, it is hours of sheer intimidation and screaming. Hitler threatens invasion right then and there and delivers an impossible ultimatum. First, lift the ban on the Austrian Nazi Party. Second, hand over key government positions, specifically the Interior Ministry and the police, to the Nazis. And third, align Austria's foreign policy entirely with Germany's. Schuschnigg was shaken, he was isolated, and he was totally boxed in. So he signed it. He was given just 3 days to comply. But Schuschnigg wasn't quite finished. When he got back to Vienna, he made one final desperate gamble. On March 9th, he announced a surprise referendum. In just 4 days, the Austrian people would vote on whether they wanted a free, independent, social, Christian, and united Austria. And you know what? The polls suggested he might actually win, predicting somewhere around 65 to 70% in favor of independence. Well, Hitler was absolutely furious. A legitimate democratic vote confirming Austrian independence would be a catastrophic setback for his plans. So he moved immediately. German military units were ordered straight to the border, and a new ultimatum was handed to Schuschnigg. Cancel the referendum resign, and hand power to the Austrian Nazi leader or face an immediate full-scale invasion. Schuschnigg frantically reached out to Britain and France begging for support, but the response was devastatingly clear. They would not intervene. They left him totally high and dry. With zero allies and desperate to avoid a bloodbath, Schuschnigg yielded to force. He went on the radio for his final address, his voice literally breaking as he explained to his people that he was stepping down just to prevent a war. He ended his address with a heartbreaking sign-off: God protect Austria. That very night, he was arrested by the Gestapo. He would go on to spend the next 7 years surviving in concentration camps.
Section 3. The Dark Side of Anschluss, Shattering the Peaceful Myth.
185,000. That was the Jewish population of Vienna at the time of the Anschluss. It was actually the largest Jewish community in the entire German-speaking world. And while there were all these chaotic but totally unopposed military parades happening out in the countryside, what unfolded in the capital city of Vienna was immediate, visceral horror. So the absolutely crucial point here is that not everyone cheered. Within hours of the German forces entering, severe anti-Semitic violence erupted on the streets of Vienna. It was an incredibly ugly juxtaposition to the celebrations happening elsewhere. Jewish residents were dragged right out of their homes, forced to scrub the streets on their hands and knees, while crowds of their neighbors watched and laughed. Businesses were violently looted, apartments were seized, and this wasn't some slow, gradual implementation of policy. It moved at a pace that shocked even Nazi officials, who were used to the much slower rate of persecution back in Germany. A man named Adolf Hitler was sent to Vienna specifically to organize forced emigration, building a brutally efficient system there that would tragically later serve as a model for the Holocaust. Famous figures, like Sigmund Freud, were forced to flee to London, while tens of thousands of others desperately tried to follow, though so many just couldn't get out in time. Overnight, an entire vibrant community was stripped of their rights, their property, and their humanity. Section 4. The world does nothing. The failure of international diplomacy. So, what was the international reaction to all this? It was muted to the point of being totally meaningless. Britain and France issued formal protests, the League of Nations had a little discussion, and then nothing. Crickets. You might be wondering, why the silence? Well, the dominant view in Britain at the time, particularly that of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, asked a seemingly simple question. Wasn't this simply national self-determination? He argued that, well, it was regrettable, but perhaps not worth starting a massive war over. After all, weren't most Austrians German-speaking? Didn't this align with the very principle of national self-determination championed after World War I? Guys, this is an incredibly dangerous and convenient logic. It's analytical cowardice, really, because that logic completely ignored the coercion. It ignored the severe intimidation and the literal threat of a military invasion. And worst of all, it willfully ignored the 185,000 Jews of Vienna, whose lives were being utterly destroyed in broad daylight. And this diplomatic cowardice handed Germany a massive strategic advantage. The map of Europe and the entire balance of power shifted literally overnight. Germany just absorbed 7 million people. They seized Austria's gold and foreign currency reserves, which, by the way, the German economy desperately needed at that moment. They integrated the entire Austrian industrial capacity right into their war machine, and they absorbed the Austrian military, adding several fully equipped divisions to the Wehrmacht. But geographically, here is perhaps the most critical point. Germany now surrounded Czechoslovakia on 3 sides. They gained immense, world-shifting resources without shedding a single drop of German blood. And this brings us to the ultimate takeaway from the Anschluss. It wasn't just a territorial land grab. It was a test. A massive test of Hitler's nerve, of Austrian resistance, and most importantly, of Western resolve. Hitler had taken a huge gamble here. His military, which actually suffered from broken-down tanks and terrible logistics during the march into Austria, was definitely not ready for a serious, sustained war with major powers. If Britain and France had actually mobilized their forces, the German army might have faced a fight it simply couldn't win. But the West didn't move. They protested, they condemned, and they stayed home. The conclusion Hitler drew was completely obvious, and it echoed the exact same lesson from the remilitarization of the Rhineland 2 years prior. The Western powers simply lacked the will to fight. Framing the Anschluss as some inevitable, peaceful reunion of German-speaking peoples totally obscures the brutal reality of what actually happened. It was achieved through intense threats, and it was made possible by the absolute unwillingness of the international community to step up and uphold the rule of law. Every single time Hitler tested that unwillingness and found it confirmed, he just grew bolder. Every single concession fed his next demand, setting the stage perfectly for the horrors of World War II. The pattern of appeasement was now entirely clear to anyone paying attention. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly gripping question to ponder. How far would it go before someone finally said stop? The true, devastating cost of choosing peace at any price was only just beginning to reveal itself. Thank you so much for walking through this crucial history with me in today's Explainer. Make sure you take these lessons and really look closely at the patterns of power and diplomacy in our world today.